I was researching the architectural history of major universities, and I noticed something odd about their founding stories. Not just the buildings themselves, the locations, the land. Many of America's oldest and most prestigious universities sit on sites that were previously hospitals, asylums, or healing institutions. Official histories call this coincidence or practical reuse of existing infrastructure. Simple explanations for convenient arrangements. But the architectural features tell a different story, a more disturbing story. High ceilings specifically designed for air circulation, 20 feet or more when 10 would suffice for classrooms. Elaborate ventilation systems integrated into walls, far more sophisticated than educational buildings require. Specific window placements calculated for natural light therapy at precise angles throughout the day. Courtyards and gardens carefully integrated into building layouts, positioned for views from interior rooms. Domed reading rooms with acoustic properties that go far beyond what studying requires. Creating sound environments that modern engineers struggle to explain. These aren't just beautiful old buildings that happen to be available for repurposing when universities needed space. They're healing facilities, whose original therapeutic purpose is still visible in every architectural detail, every design choice, every structural element. If you know what you're looking at, look at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, founded 1876. The original hospital building now seamlessly integrated into the campus as if it had always been part of an educational complex. Features architecture specifically and deliberately designed for patient healing. 20-foot ceilings in patient wards, where 12 feet would be adequate for medical care, windows positioned to provide natural light throughout the day, calculated for specific solar angles that modern photobiology confirms have therapeutic benefits. Ventilation shafts integrated into walls, in patterns that create natural air circulation through thermal convection. But here's what's deeply strange. The architectural plans predate modern medical understanding of these therapeutic benefits by decades. The 1870s didn't have germ theory widely accepted or implemented in medical practice. They didn't understand the healing properties of natural light, or have scientific validation of its effects. They didn't know the importance of air circulation for patient recovery in ways that would justify such elaborate ventilation systems. Yet the buildings were designed with precise specifications to maximize these exact factors. The architecture demonstrates knowledge of therapeutic principles that supposedly didn't exist in practical applied form when these structures were built. And it's not just Johns Hopkins. Yale University's old campus includes buildings from the 1750s that show identical features. Connecticut Hall, built 1750, still standing, still in daily use, has ceiling heights of 18 feet. Not 16, not 15, but precisely 18. Massive windows with specific southern and eastern exposures. Positioned not for symmetry, but for calculated solar angles. Internal courtyards designed not just for aesthetics, but for creating air circulation patterns and providing natural light access to interior rooms. The official history says these were dormitories and classrooms from the beginning. Simple educational facilities for colonial students. But the architectural features don't match that explanation. They match healing institutions from the same era. The proportions are identical. The window placements follow the same patterns. The ventilation systems use the same engineering principles. The integration of outdoor green spaces visible from interior rooms follows therapeutic design standards, all characteristics of medical and healing architecture, not conventional educational facilities of the period. Harvard's oldest buildings tell the same story with even more specificity. Massachusetts Hall, 1720, the oldest surviving building on campus. Hollis Hall, 1763. Stoughton Hall, 1804. All featuring architectural elements that dramatically exceed what dormitory or classroom use requires. Ceiling heights ranging between 16 and 20 feet when 8 or 9 feet would be adequate for habitation. Window configurations designed for maximum natural light penetration at specific angles, with mathematical precision in their placement. Ventilation systems more sophisticated than simple residential buildings would need. Elaborate networks of shafts and vents, creating continuous air circulation. And the spacing between buildings not random, not based on available land, but carefully calculated to ensure air circulation and sunlight access to every structure. Walk Harvard Yard with this in mind. Notice how the buildings are positioned, the gaps between them, the orientations. This isn't random campus planning by colonial administrators finding convenient spots to erect new buildings. This is intentional therapeutic architecture applied systematically across the entire complex with precise engineering standards. The pattern extends to European institutions with even more dramatic examples. Oxford University's oldest colleges show identical features, sometimes in even more elaborate forms. Christ Church, founded 1546, includes the Great Hall with a ceiling height of 50 feet. Not 45, not 48, but 50 feet of vertical space for a dining hall. Elaborate ventilation achieved through carved stone screens that are simultaneously decorative and functional. Creating air pathways that maintain circulation without visible modern vents. Window proportions calculated with mathematical precision for specific light qualities at different times of day. Morning light from the east, afternoon illumination from the south and west, all designed to create specific atmospheric conditions for different daily activities. The official explanation for these features: they demonstrate wealth, power, and institutional status. Impressive spaces to awe visitors and students. But examine the technical precision more carefully. The angles are too specific to be merely aesthetic. The measurements too exact to be random demonstrations of wealth. The ventilation too sophisticated to be accidental byproducts of grand design. These buildings were engineered for environmental control at levels that suggest purposes beyond education, prestige, or impressing donors. They were designed to maintain specific atmospheric conditions that would support healing and health maintenance. Cambridge University shows even more explicit connections to healing facilities. Addenbrooke's Hospital, established 1766, eventually became formally incorporated into the university system in later centuries. But before that official institutional connection, the architectural similarities between the hospital and the older college buildings were already present and striking. The college buildings from earlier centuries, some dating to the 1200s and 1300s, display identical healing architecture characteristics that predate the hospital by 500 years. High ceilings, specific window orientations calculated for therapeutic light exposure, internal courtyards with carefully maintained gardens positioned for views from interior spaces, covered walkways connecting buildings to allow movement between spaces while maintaining environmental control and protection from weather. The therapeutic design principles are embedded in structures built 5 centuries before any official connection to medical facilities existed. This suggests either that the educational buildings were always therapeutic in nature, or that both educational and medical institutions were drawing from the same architectural knowledge base that understood healing environments. Consider what these architectural features actually accomplish in measurable physiological terms. 20-foot ceilings aren't just aesthetic grandeur or demonstrations of institutional wealth. They create substantial air volume that actively moderates temperature fluctuations and maintains air quality through natural thermal convection. Hot air rises, creating continuous circulation that refreshes the entire room without any mechanical systems or energy input. The large volume dilutes airborne contaminants, diseases, dust particles, volatile organic compounds, odors, making the space demonstrably healthier for occupants by simple physics. Modern hospitals use expensive mechanical HVAC systems running continuously to achieve what these buildings accomplished through architectural design alone, through understanding and application of thermodynamic principles. Someone understood thermodynamics and air quality management at practical levels that supposedly weren't achieved until the late 1800s at the earliest. Yet these buildings from the 1700s and earlier demonstrate that knowledge embedded in their very structure. The window placements show similar sophistication, not randomly positioned for symmetry or light, carefully calculated for specific solar angles throughout the year. Southern exposure provides consistent natural light without harsh glare. Eastern windows capture morning sun, proven in modern studies to regulate circadian rhythms and improve mental health. Western exposure is minimized to avoid afternoon heat. Northern light provides even illumination for detailed work. These aren't intuitive choices. They require understanding the relationship between building orientation, solar angles, seasonal variations, and human physiology. Knowledge that was supposedly primitive or non-existent when these buildings were constructed. The ventilation systems are perhaps most revealing. Stone buildings from the 1700s and earlier shouldn't have sophisticated air circulation. Yet examination of the structures reveals intentional designs for moving air. Vents integrated into walls, shafts connecting rooms to roof spaces, carefully positioned openings creating cross-ventilation paths. Air enters cool from north sides, warms as it circulates, exits through high vents. Natural convection drives the system. No mechanical power required. The result? Consistent air exchange that maintains quality and temperature. The engineering rivals modern HVAC design while using only architectural principles and thermal physics. Look at the University of Pennsylvania, founded 1740. The original buildings no longer stand, but architectural records describe features matching the pattern. High ceilings, elaborate window arrangements, integration with what was then Pennsylvania Hospital, the first hospital in America. The connection wasn't incidental. The educational and healing functions were intentionally combined in a single architectural complex. Students learned in buildings designed for therapeutic purposes. The environment itself was part of the healing and learning process. An integrated approach that official histories barely acknowledge. Columbia University in New York shows similar origins. King's College, as it was originally known, established 1754 in a building adjacent to the city hospital. The architectural drawings show shared design principles. Ceiling heights matching hospital wards. Window configurations identical to healing spaces, shared courtyards and gardens. The official narrative says the hospital happened to be nearby, but the architectural integration suggests deliberate planning. The college and hospital were designed as complementary parts of a unified system, not separate institutions that coincidentally occupied adjacent spaces. The University of Edinburgh in Scotland makes the connection explicit. The medical school, established 1726, operated from buildings that show healing architecture throughout. But the entire university complex, older buildings dating to the 1500s, displays the same features: high ceilings, specific window placements, elaborate ventilation, internal gardens visible from multiple rooms. The healing architecture predates the official medical school by 2 centuries. Either the older buildings were already designed for therapeutic purposes, or the architectural principles were so well understood that they were applied to all significant construction regardless of stated function. This raises uncomfortable questions about what universities actually were. The official narrative has them as purely educational institutions, places for learning, scholarship, intellectual development. But the architecture tells a different story. These were healing environments, therapeutic spaces, buildings designed to maintain health and facilitate recovery. The integration of educational and healing functions wasn't incidental, it was intentional. Universities weren't just places to learn, they were places to be healed while learning. The Tartarian connection becomes harder to dismiss when you examine the sophistication. The architectural knowledge required to design these buildings exceeded what the official timeline credits to those eras. Understanding thermodynamics well enough to create passive climate control. Knowing the healing properties of natural light before modern photobiology. Engineering ventilation systems that rival mechanical equivalents. Integrating psychological benefits of garden views before psychiatric medicine acknowledged such effects. This wasn't trial and error. This wasn't lucky guessing. This was applied knowledge of principles that supposedly weren't understood until centuries later. And here's what makes it suspicious. The knowledge disappeared. Buildings from the 1700s and earlier show sophisticated healing architecture. Then, during the 1800s, the principles seem to be forgotten. Hospital and institutional construction becomes utilitarian. Plain boxes with minimal windows, low ceilings, poor ventilation, no integration with natural elements. The degradation is dramatic. It's as if the builders of the earlier period possessed knowledge that later generations lost or deliberately abandoned. The official explanation, architectural styles changed, doesn't account for the functional regression. These weren't aesthetic choices. They were engineering decisions that made buildings objectively worse for their occupants. The university-hospital connection was often severed during the same period. Institutions that had operated with integrated healing and educational functions were separated. The hospitals moved to different buildings or different locations. The original therapeutic architecture was repurposed for dormitories, libraries, administrative offices. The healing function was written out of the official histories. Within a generation or two, people forgot these buildings had therapeutic origins. They became just universities. Beautiful old buildings whose architectural sophistication was attributed to aesthetics rather than acknowledged as functional healing design. But the architecture remains. You can still see it. Visit any of these campuses. Stand in the old buildings. Notice the ceiling heights. Look at the window placements. Find the ventilation shafts built into walls. Observe how the buildings are positioned relative to each other. See the gardens and courtyards integrated into the layouts. The healing architecture is still there, still functioning. The buildings still moderate temperature through passive convection. Still provide natural light therapy through calculated window placements. Still circulate air through ventilation systems built into the structure. The therapeutic environment still exists, even though its original purpose has been officially forgotten. Some university administrators are starting to rediscover what their buildings were designed for. Studies show students in the oldest buildings report better mental health outcomes, better focus, less illness, improved academic performance. The buildings are working as designed, maintaining health and facilitating intellectual development. But the studies treat this as unexpected, as if the architectural features are accidentally beneficial rather than intentionally therapeutic. The original purpose remains officially unacknowledged even as its effects are measured and documented. The Georgetown University campus in Washington, D.C. shows the pattern clearly. Healy Hall, built 1879, features architecture explicitly based on hospital design. The architects studied therapeutic institutions before designing the academic building. The result? 25-foot ceilings, elaborate ventilation, specific window orientations, integrated green spaces. The building was designed to be healthy, not just beautiful, and it works. Healy Hall consistently rates as the best study environment on campus. Students report feeling better physically and mentally when working there. The architecture is doing what it was designed to do, maintaining health and supporting intellectual function. The University of Virginia, designed by Thomas Jefferson in 1819, makes the therapeutic intention explicit in his writings. Jefferson wrote about the importance of air quality, natural light, and connection to natural elements for student health and learning. His architectural plans incorporated these principles systematically. The rotunda's dome creates natural air circulation. The lawn's design ensures every room has optimal light and airflow. The covered walkways allow movement between buildings while maintaining environmental control. Jefferson understood these buildings as health-supporting environments, not just educational facilities. His writings acknowledge what official histories now dismiss, that architecture profoundly affects physical and mental well-being. But here's where it gets stranger. Jefferson's design principles weren't original to him. He explicitly based them on older buildings he'd studied in Europe. Buildings from the 1500s and 1600s, buildings that demonstrated the same therapeutic architectural features. Jefferson was preserving and applying knowledge that already existed in earlier construction. He wasn't inventing these principles, he was preventing them from being lost. And his documentation suggests he knew the knowledge was being deliberately suppressed or forgotten. His writings have urgency. Preserve this, remember this, apply this before it's lost. The suppression becomes visible in architectural changes during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Universities built new buildings that abandoned the therapeutic principles: plain rectangles, low ceilings, minimal windows, poor ventilation, concrete and brick replacing stone. The new construction was cheaper, faster, more utilitarian. But it was objectively worse for the people using it. Students in the new buildings showed increased illness, decreased academic performance, higher rates of mental health problems. The architecture was no longer supporting health, it was undermining it. Yet the new building styles spread rapidly, replacing the therapeutic designs with functional but harmful environments. The timing coincides with other changes. The late 1800s saw the consolidation of medical practice under allopathic control. Alternative healing approaches were suppressed. Natural and architectural healing methods were dismissed as unscientific. The idea that building design could affect health was ridiculed. Suddenly, the ancient knowledge embedded in therapeutic architecture became superstition. The buildings were called beautiful, but their functional sophistication was denied. Within a generation, the healing architecture of universities was officially forgotten, even as the buildings continued functioning exactly as designed. This fits the pattern of Tartarian knowledge suppression. Advanced understanding of natural principles, thermodynamics, light therapy, acoustic design, environmental psychology, was embedded in practical architecture. The buildings functioned as healing facilities that also supported learning. Then, the knowledge was dismissed as primitive superstition. The buildings were repurposed without acknowledgement of their original therapeutic function. Later construction abandoned the sophisticated principles in favor of utilitarian designs that saved money while harming occupants. The loss of knowledge was presented as progress toward modern approaches, but the modern approaches were objectively inferior. The older buildings worked better. The therapeutic architecture was more sophisticated than what replaced it. Walk through Harvard Yard, stand in University Hall. Built 1815. Notice how the space feels different from newer buildings. The air quality, the light, the acoustic properties, the temperature regulation. The building creates a specific environment that affects how you feel and think. This isn't subjective appreciation of old architecture. This is measurable physiological response to engineered environmental factors. The building was designed to do this, and it still does, over 200 years later, without any mechanical systems. The architecture creates and maintains a therapeutic environment that supports health and intellectual function. The dome structures present in many university buildings show particularly sophisticated design. The rotundas, reading rooms, assembly halls, these weren't just impressive spaces, they were acoustic and environmental engineering. Domed ceilings create specific sound properties that enhance speech clarity while reducing echo and noise. The curved shape naturally circulates air through thermal convection. The height allows for clerestory windows that provide even, indirect natural light. These spaces were designed as healing environments where people could gather, learn, and be restored. The acoustic properties support clear communication. The air quality and lighting reduce stress and fatigue. The spaces actively support the therapeutic and educational functions they were built for. Yet official architectural histories treat these features as aesthetic choices. The domes are impressive or classical in style or demonstrating institutional prestige. The functional sophistication is rarely acknowledged. The acoustic engineering is treated as fortunate accident rather than intentional design. The thermal properties are mentioned as trivia rather than recognized as primary design objectives. The healing architecture is hidden in plain sight. Still functioning, still affecting everyone who enters these spaces, but officially denied and unacknowledged. The question becomes, who designed these buildings? The architects of record often seem inadequate to explain the sophistication. Men with limited formal training producing buildings that demonstrate advanced understanding of physics, physiology, and psychology. Buildings whose environmental engineering rivals or exceeds modern mechanical systems. Buildings that integrate natural elements in ways that modern architecture struggles to replicate even with computer modeling and sophisticated technology. Either these architects were exceptional geniuses whose knowledge exceeded their era by centuries, or they were working from existing templates and principles created by an earlier civilization. The Tartarian explanation suggests the latter, an advanced civilization that understood natural principles at deep, practical levels. They built therapeutic architecture that integrated environmental control, acoustic design, and psychological support. The buildings served multiple functions: healing, learning, gathering, living. Then that civilization declined or was deliberately destroyed. The buildings remained, repurposed by later inhabitants who didn't fully understand their sophistication. The therapeutic architecture was relabeled as educational or administrative. The healing functions were forgotten. Later construction attempted to copy the appearance without understanding the principles, resulting in buildings that looked similar but lacked the functional sophistication. This explains why university buildings from the 1700s and earlier are so much more sophisticated than those from the late 1800s and early 1900s. The older buildings were either original Tartarian construction or built by people who still had access to Tartarian knowledge and templates. The newer buildings were constructed after that knowledge was lost or suppressed. The architectural regression from sophisticated therapeutic design to simple utilitarian boxes marks the point where the original knowledge was no longer accessible or acceptable to use. Stand in one of these spaces today: the reading room at the Library of Congress, the Great Hall at MYT's Building 10, the Rotunda at any major university with pre-1850 architecture. Feel how the space affects you. Notice the air quality, the lighting, the acoustic properties, the psychological impact of the proportions and materials. These effects aren't accidental, they're designed, and the design demonstrates knowledge that the official timeline claims didn't exist when these buildings were created. Someone knew how to create healing environments through architectural principles alone. Someone understood thermodynamics, photobiology, acoustic physics, and environmental psychology well enough to engineer spaces that measurably support human health and function. That knowledge is still embedded in these buildings, still working, still affecting the millions of students who occupy these spaces every year. But officially, we've forgotten it existed. We attribute the benefits to aesthetics or tradition. We build new facilities that abandon the sophisticated principles in favor of cheaper construction. And we wonder why students in the new buildings show increased stress, illness, and decreased academic performance compared to those in the old therapeutic architecture. We've forgotten what our ancestors knew, or more precisely, we've been taught to dismiss and ignore what the buildings still demonstrate. The healing architecture of universities isn't historical curiosity. It's evidence of knowledge we've lost and desperately need to rediscover.